For a long time, I believed something very simple. I believed that once you became smart enough, money would stop being confusing. If you understood numbers, if you planned carefully, if you worked hard and avoided obvious mistakes, money would eventually fall into place. And yet, the more intelligent people I met, the more this belief started to crack. I met engineers who could solve complex problems in minutes, but felt constant anxiety every time they checked their bank accounts. I met doctors and consultants with high incomes who still felt one bad decision away from losing control. I met thoughtful, disciplined people who did everything right, yet never felt calm around money. At first, I assumed they were missing information. Maybe they hadn't read the right book yet. Maybe they didn't understand investing deeply enough. And maybe they just needed a better strategy. But over time, something became impossible to ignore. Their confusion with money didn't come from ignorance. It came from something much deeper. What I began to see, slowly, quietly, was this. Money doesn't respond to intelligence the way we think it does. It responds to behavior, to emotion, to memory, to identity. And those things don't automatically improve just because you're smart. I remember a period in my own life when, on paper, everything looked fine. I wasn't struggling, I wasn't reckless. I understood basic financial principles. But internally, money still felt heavy. Every decision carried tension. Every choice felt loaded with consequences. Saving never felt like enough. Spending never felt fully safe. So there was always a low-level noise in the background, a quiet sense that I should be doing better, deciding faster, knowing more. What confused me most was this. I knew better, yet I didn't feel better. That was the moment I stopped asking, how do I make better financial decisions? And started asking a different question. Why does money still feel emotional, even when the math makes sense? This audiobook is born from that question. It is not a guide to getting rich. It is not a collection of clever tactics. And it is not here to impress you with complexity. It is an exploration of something far more uncomfortable and far more freeing. The inner relationship smart people have with money. Because here is a truth we rarely say out loud. Some of the most financially confused people are also the most intellectually capable. Not because they lack discipline, not because they are careless, and certainly not because they are unintelligent, but because intelligence can create blind spots. Smart people are trained to trust their thinking, to rely on analysis, to believe that if something feels unclear, the solution must be more reasoning. Money doesn't always work that way. Money touches parts of us that logic doesn't fully govern. It touches fear, of instability, of loss, of falling behind. It touches identity, what success means, what safety looks like, what enough feels like. It touches memory, what we saw growing up, what we lived through, what we promised ourselves we'd never repeat. And those layers don't disappear when you become educated. If anything, they become better hidden. This is why so many smart people feel frustrated with themselves around money. They don't understand why clarity doesn't arrive the way it does in other areas of life. They wonder why discipline works everywhere except here. They feel a quiet shame for struggling with something they believe they should have mastered by now. If that sounds familiar, let me say this clearly before we go any further. There is nothing wrong with you. Your confusion is not a personal failure. It is a signal that money is not asking you to think harder, but to understand yourself more honestly. Throughout this audiobook, we will look at the subtle psychological patterns that shape financial behavior. Not in a judgmental way, not in a dramatic way, but in a grounded, human way. And we'll talk about why intelligence doesn't protect us from emotional decisions. Why knowledge sometimes increases anxiety instead of reducing it. Why comparison quietly distorts our sense of sufficiency. And why clarity often arrives only when identity settles, not when spreadsheets improve. I'll also share observations drawn from real people, friends, family members, professionals who looked successful from the outside, yet privately struggled with the same quiet tension. Not to expose them, but to normalize something we rarely talk about. Money confusion is not a sign of weakness. It is often a sign of unresolved inner conflict. This audiobook isn't meant to rush you towards solutions. It's meant to slow you down enough to see what's actually happening, to notice patterns you may have rationalized for years, to recognize emotional habits that never responded to logic in the first place, and to understand why peace with money usually comes before progress, not after it. If you're listening to this hoping for quick answers, this may feel unfamiliar. But if you're listening because you're tired of feeling quietly unsettled, tired of knowing what to do but not feeling aligned doing it, then you're in the right place. We're not here to fix money. We're here to understand why it has felt confusing despite your intelligence. And once that understanding settles, something interesting tends to happen. The noise softens, decisions slow down, and money begins to feel less like a test you're failing, and more like a tool you're finally learning how to hold. Let's begin there. Chapter 1. Intelligence doesn't protect you from money. Confusion. There's a quiet assumption many intelligent people carry for years without questioning it. The assumption is that intelligence should make money simpler. If you can reason clearly, analyze trade-offs, and think long-term, money should eventually stop being stressful. Confusion should fade as understanding grows, but for many people, the opposite happens. The smarter they are, the more tangled money feels. This isn't because intelligence fails. It's because intelligence is applied in the wrong place. Money is not primarily a thinking problem. It is a behavioral and emotional one. Intelligence excels at logic, structure, and prediction. Money decisions, however, are rarely made in calm, neutral conditions. They are made under uncertainty, pressure, and incomplete information, often while the nervous system is activated. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A highly intelligent person can understand every option available to them and still feel stuck. Not because they don't know what to do, but because knowledge alone does not settle emotional risk. Consider how people actually behave around money. They hesitate longer than necessary. They revisit decisions they already understand. They delay action while gathering information they won't use. From the outside, this looks cautious. From the inside, it feels exhausting. What's happening isn't confusion about numbers. It's conflict between internal states. One part of the mind is focused on optimization, making the best possible choice. Another part is focused on protection, avoiding loss, embarrassment, or regret. Intelligence serves the first part very well. It struggles with the second. This is why intelligence doesn't protect against money confusion. It often amplifies it. Smart people are trained to believe that if something feels unclear, the solution is more thinking. When discomfort appears, they respond by analyzing harder. They read more. They calculate more. They compare more scenarios. But analysis does not calm fear. It often feeds it. Each new piece of information introduces another possible outcome, another risk, another reason to hesitate. Over time, thinking becomes a way to delay emotional exposure rather than resolve uncertainty. This is not weakness, it is a learned pattern. Many intelligent people grew up being rewarded for getting things right. Accuracy mattered. Precision mattered. Mistakes carried consequences. Over time, this trained a deep association between being wrong and being unsafe. Money activates that association quickly. Because money mistakes don't just feel like bad decisions. They feel like personal failures. So the mind tries to eliminate risk completely. It tries to find certainty where none exists. That effort creates confusion. You see this pattern clearly when you compare people with similar knowledge but different emotional temperaments. One person makes a decision with incomplete information, adjusts later, and moves on. Another person studies the decision endlessly, unable to tolerate the possibility of regret. The difference is not intelligence, it is tolerance for uncertainty. Money clarity depends far more on that tolerance than on analytical skill. And another reason intelligence fails to protect people is that it creates an illusion of control. Smart people are used to systems where effort and understanding reliably produce results. Learn the rules, apply them correctly, and outcomes improve. Money does not behave that way. There is randomness. Timing matters. External factors interfere. No amount of intelligence can remove those elements. For people who rely heavily on their thinking to feel secure, this is deeply unsettling. They keep searching for the right answer, the decision that guarantees safety. It doesn't exist, and the longer they search, the more unstable they feel. This leads to a subtle form of paralysis that many smart people don't recognize as fear. They call it being careful. They call it waiting for clarity. They call it not rushing. But emotionally, it's avoidance. Avoidance of responsibility, avoidance of possible regret, avoidance of having to live with uncertainty. Here's a real-world example that appears again and again. Someone earns well, saves consistently, and understands basic investing principles. On paper, they are doing fine. Yet every financial decision feels heavy. They worry about whether they're doing enough, choosing correctly, or missing something important. They aren't confused about money mechanics. They are confused about trust. They don't trust the process. They don't trust themselves. They don't trust that mistakes will be survivable. So they keep thinking. Thinking becomes a substitute for confidence. Another pattern shows up in people who pride themselves on being rational. They believe they are immune to emotional decision-making. They see fear and impulsiveness as traits of others, not themselves. This belief itself becomes a blind spot, because emotions don't disappear when they are ignored. They simply operate unnoticed. A person may insist they are making a logical choice while being driven by fear of falling behind, fear of judgment, or fear of instability. Intelligence provides a convincing narrative to justify the choice, but it doesn't change the underlying driver. Over time, this disconnect creates confusion. Decisions feel correct but not settled. Plans make sense but don't feel safe. Progress exists, but satisfaction doesn't. That gap is where money stress lives. What often surprises people is that those who appear most comfortable with money are not necessarily more knowledgeable. They are more emotionally regulated. They accept that not every decision will be optimal. They allow room for adjustment. They separate outcomes from identity. They don't interpret financial uncertainty as a threat to who they are. This emotional distance creates clarity, not because they think better, but because they feel steadier. Intelligence, by contrast, tends to tighten control when outcomes feel uncertain. It wants to eliminate ambiguity before moving forward. Money doesn't reward that approach. It rewards consistency, patience, and the ability to act without perfect certainty. Until someone understands this, intelligence keeps working against them. They keep asking, "Why don't I feel confident yet?" When the better question is, "What am I trying to protect myself from?" Money confusion often fades when that question is answered honestly, not with logic, with awareness, awareness of fear, awareness of identity, awareness of the stories attached to financial outcomes. This doesn't make decisions effortless, but it makes them clearer, because clarity isn't the absence of doubt, it's the ability to move without needing doubt to disappear first. Until that distinction is understood, intelligent people will continue to feel frustrated with money, not because they lack understanding, but because they expect understanding to do a job it was never meant to do. Money does not require brilliance. It requires emotional steadiness. And without that steadiness, intelligence alone will always feel like it should be enough. While quietly, failing to deliver the calm it promises. Chapter 2. Your money habits were formed before you were aware of them. Most people believe their relationship with money is the result of conscious choices. They assume their habits come from what they learned later in life, education, experience, or financial knowledge picked up along the way. In reality, most money behavior is shaped long before anyone understands what money truly is. By the time people start earning, spending, or investing, their emotional responses to money are already in place. Money habits are not created when you get your first paycheck. They are created when you first observe how money is handled around you. As a child, you don't analyze finances. You absorb them. You notice tone before logic. You notice reactions before explanations. You notice stress, silence, conflict, or calm. And your nervous system learns. For some people, money was always discussed with tension. Conversations lowered voices. Arguments appeared suddenly. Bills were associated with fear or urgency. Even without understanding numbers, the body learned that money meant instability. For others, money was rarely discussed at all. It was treated as private, uncomfortable, or even shameful. Silence taught its own lesson. This is something you don't touch, don't ask about, and don't fully understand. These early impressions don't disappear with age. They become emotional defaults. Later in life, when similar situations arise, making decisions, facing uncertainty, taking risk, the same emotional responses are triggered automatically. This is why two people with identical financial knowledge can behave very differently. One feels relatively calm making decisions with incomplete information. The other feels intense discomfort and urgency. The difference is not discipline, it's conditioning. Consider a common example. Someone grows up in a household where money is unpredictable. Income fluctuates. Bills create anxiety. Conversations often revolve around what can't be afforded. As an adult, this person may become extremely cautious. They save aggressively. They avoid risk. They feel uneasy spending money, even when they can afford it. From the outside, this looks responsible. Internally, it feels like constant vigilance. Another person grows up in an environment where money is used to soothe stress. Spending becomes a reward, a way to feel better after tension or disappointment. As an adult, they may intellectually understand budgeting and restraint, and yet still feel drawn to spending during emotional moments. They aren't ignorant, they are repeating a learned emotional pattern. Money behavior often makes sense once you understand its origin, but most people never trace it back. They assume their reactions are rational, current, and chosen. They don't realize they are reenacting old emotional scripts. This is why trying harder rarely works. You can override behavior temporarily. You can force discipline for a while, but emotional patterns eventually resurface because money habits are not just habits, they are safety strategies. At some point, they helped you cope. Saving excessively may have protected you from fear. Spending freely may have helped you feel in control. Avoiding decisions may have kept you from making mistakes. These strategies were adaptive once. The problem is that they don't automatically update. What protected you at one stage of life may restrict you later. This creates a specific kind of confusion that many smart people experience. They know their behavior isn't optimal. They understand alternatives, but changing feels uncomfortable, even threatening. That discomfort is not irrational. Your nervous system doesn't respond to logic. It responds to perceived safety. This is why people often repeat money behaviors they consciously dislike. They criticize themselves for procrastinating, overspending, or being overly cautious, without realizing that part of them believes this behavior is necessary. You see this clearly in families. One sibling becomes extremely conservative with money, another becomes impulsive. Both grew up in the same household, and yet each internalized a different response. One learned that control equals safety. The other learned that relief equals safety. Neither response is wrong. Both are incomplete. Understanding this reframes the entire conversation. Money confusion is not about being careless or unprepared. It's about operating with outdated emotional instructions. This also explains why advice often fails. Generic financial advice assumes people are blank slates. It assumes behavior changes once information is provided. But information doesn't rewrite emotional memory. Telling someone who grew up with instability to take more risk ignores the fact that risk feels like danger, not opportunity. Telling someone who associates spending with relief to just budget better ignores the emotional function spending serves. Without addressing the underlying pattern, advice feels disconnected from reality. This is where many people become frustrated with themselves. They feel like they are sabotaging their own progress. They wonder why change feels so hard when the solution seems obvious. The truth is simpler and more compassionate. They are not resisting improvement. They are protecting themselves. Once this is understood, a shift becomes possible. Instead of asking, "How do I fix my money habits?" a better question emerges. What was this habit originally trying to solve? When people answer that honestly, clarity begins to form. Someone realizes they save excessively because safety was once fragile. Someone realizes they avoid decisions because mistakes were once punished harshly. Someone realizes they overspend because comfort was inconsistent. This awareness doesn't erase the habit overnight, but it removes shame. And without shame, behavior becomes easier to examine. Change doesn't start with forcing new rules. It starts with understanding old ones. This is why financial clarity often arrives later in life. Not because people suddenly learn more, but because they finally understand themselves. They see that their confusion isn't random, it's patterned. And patterns, once recognized, lose much of their power. Money habits formed early can be updated, but only after they are seen clearly. Until then, people keep trying to solve present-day problems with childhood strategies. And that mismatch is what creates confusion. Not lack of discipline, not lack of intelligence, just unexamined history. Chapter 3. Why more financial knowledge often creates more confusion. There is a moment many intelligent people quietly experience but rarely talk about. They know more about money than ever before, yet they feel less certain than they did when they knew less. They have read the books. They understand basic investing principles. They follow financial discussions with ease. And still, when it comes time to make decisions, clarity doesn't arrive. This feels deeply frustrating, because knowledge is supposed to reduce confusion. That's how it works in most areas of life. With money, it often does the opposite. This isn't because financial knowledge is useless. It's because of how the human mind responds to too many options under uncertainty. Every new piece of financial information introduces another possibility, another strategy, and another framework, another warning. For a mind trained to optimize, this creates a problem. Which one is correct? Which one applies now? Which one minimizes regret? Instead of narrowing choices, knowledge expands them. This is especially true for intelligent people who are good at seeing nuance. They don't just see one path. They see 10 plausible ones, each with trade-offs, each with risks, each with advocates who sound confident. The result is not empowerment, it is overload. At some point, learning stops serving clarity and starts feeding anxiety. Consider a common situation. Someone begins learning about investing. At first, things feel simple. Save consistently, think long-term, avoid obvious mistakes. Then the information deepens. They learn about asset allocation, tax efficiency, market cycles, behavioral finance. Each layer adds insight, but also complexity. Soon, every decision feels loaded. Should I invest now or wait? Should I adjust my strategy? Am I being too conservative or too aggressive? The person is no longer ignorant. They are uncertain. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for people who value competence. This leads to a subtle psychological shift. Learning stops being about understanding. It becomes about reducing discomfort. People read not to gain clarity, but to feel safer. They hope that one more article, one more podcast, one more perspective will finally remove doubt. It rarely does. Because doubt isn't caused by lack of information, it's caused by conflicting priorities inside the mind. Knowledge doesn't resolve that conflict. It exposes it. And another reason knowledge increases confusion is that financial information is often presented without emotional context. Advice assumes a neutral decision maker, someone who evaluates options calmly and acts accordingly. Real people don't operate that way. They bring fear, memory, and identity into every decision. So when advice conflicts, when one expert says, do this, and another says, avoid that, the mind doesn't just evaluate logic. It evaluates threat. Which advice feels safer? Which one reduces the chance of feeling foolish later? Which one protects my self-image? These questions are emotional, not analytical. And when emotion enters the equation, more information often increases pressure. You see this clearly in people who delay action for years. They are not lazy. They are not careless. No, they are overwhelmed by the responsibility of choosing correctly. They believe that with enough research, the right answer will reveal itself. But money doesn't offer certainty. It offers probability. And probability is uncomfortable for minds that prefer precision. This creates a specific trap for intelligent people. They mistake complexity for sophistication. They assume that a complex strategy must be better than a simple one. That deeper understanding requires more moving parts. But complexity doesn't equal clarity. In many cases, it destroys it. People begin to lose sight of the basics. Consistency, time, behavior. These don't feel impressive. They don't satisfy the desire to be smart. So the mind looks for something more advanced, something that feels worthy of its capability. Ironically, this is where confusion deepens. And another overlooked factor is identity. For many intelligent people, being knowledgeable becomes part of who they are. They take pride in understanding things deeply. So not knowing what to do with money feels threatening, not just practically, but personally. Admitting uncertainty feels like admitting inadequacy. This creates pressure to keep learning, even when learning is no longer helpful. The result is a strange contradiction. The more someone knows, the harder it becomes to act simply. They feel that simple decisions don't reflect their level of understanding. So they hesitate. They wait for a more refined answer. They wait for clarity that matches their intelligence. That clarity rarely comes. People who feel most at ease with money often know less than you expect. Not because they are uninformed, but because they are selective. They limit the amount of information they consume. They stick to principles rather than predictions. They accept that not every decision needs to be optimal. This acceptance reduces mental noise. It allows decisions to settle. Knowledge, when unconstrained, does the opposite. It keeps the mind spinning. Another subtle issue is that financial knowledge often highlights risk without teaching emotional tolerance for it. People learn what can go wrong. They learn about crashes, losses, and mistakes. What they don't learn is how to emotionally process those outcomes. So knowledge increases awareness of danger without increasing resilience. This makes people cautious, but not confident. They see risk everywhere, but don't trust themselves to handle it. This is why some people know exactly what they should do and still can't do it. The issue isn't motivation, it's emotional capacity. Capacity to tolerate uncertainty. Capacity to accept imperfection. Capacity to recover from mistakes without self-punishment. Knowledge doesn't build that capacity. Experience does. Reflection does. self-trust does. Until those develop, learning more often makes money feel heavier. This reframes the problem entirely. The issue is not that people are undereducated about money. It's that they are overexposed without emotional grounding. They confuse information with readiness. True clarity doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from knowing enough and trusting yourself to adapt. When people finally reduce the amount of financial noise they consume, something interesting happens. They feel calmer, as they make fewer decisions, but better ones. They stop trying to be right and start trying to be steady. That steadiness is what knowledge was supposed to create. But knowledge alone never could, because clarity is not a function of how much you know. It is a function of how much uncertainty you can tolerate without losing your balance. Until that balance is developed, more information will always feel like more confusion. Chapter 4. Emotions decide. First, logic explains. Later. Most people like to believe they make financial decisions rationally. They imagine a process that looks something like this. Consider the facts, weigh the options, choose the best outcome. This belief is especially strong among intelligent people. They trust their ability to think clearly under pressure. But when it comes to money, this sequence is rarely accurate. In reality, emotion moves first. Logic comes later, not to decide, but to justify. This is not a flaw in character. It is how the human brain is built. Long before conscious thought engages, the brain evaluates safety. Is this risky? Is this threatening? Is this familiar? Money triggers these questions instantly because money is tied to survival, status, and control. It signals stability or the lack of it. So by the time logic begins analyzing numbers, an emotional direction has often already been chosen. This explains a pattern many people don't recognize in themselves. They feel drawn toward a decision or repelled by it before they can explain why. Then they build reasons around that feeling. Those reasons sound rational. They often are rational, but they are not the origin of the decision. Consider a common scenario. Someone is presented with a financial opportunity that makes sense on paper. The risk is reasonable. The numbers are solid. Yet something inside them resists. They can't articulate it clearly. They just feel uneasy. So they start analyzing. They look for flaws. They seek confirming opinions. They focus on worst-case scenarios. Eventually, they decide not to act and feel relief. Later, so they explain the decision as being cautious or waiting for better timing. The explanation isn't false. It's incomplete. What actually drove the choice was emotion, fear of loss, fear of regret, fear of being wrong. Logic simply stepped in afterward to make the decision feel respectable. The same process happens in the opposite direction. Someone feels excitement or urgency around a financial choice. They feel the pull of possibility. Then logic is recruited to support that impulse. Risks are minimized. Downsides are reframed. Optimistic assumptions feel justified. Again, the reasoning may be sound, but it wasn't the starting point. Emotion was. This is why telling people to be more rational with money rarely works. They already believe they are. What they are actually doing is mistaking explanation for control. And another reason emotions dominate money decisions is that money is deeply personal. It reflects success, it reflects failure, it reflects worth, freedom, and security. So when a decision involves money, it often feels like a decision about identity. Will this choice make me look competent? Will it confirm that I'm responsible? Will it expose me to judgment? These questions operate below conscious awareness. Logic doesn't neutralize them. It works around them. This creates a specific kind of internal tension. People say things like, "I know what I should do, but I can't bring myself to do it." That sentence reveals everything. Knowing and feeling are not aligned. Until they are, confusion persists. This also explains why people repeat financial behaviors they intellectually disagree with, and they promise themselves they'll act differently next time. They set rules, they make plans. Then, under emotional pressure, they revert. Not because they forgot the rules, but because emotion overrides intention. Emotion moves faster than thought. This isn't a failure of discipline. It's a misunderstanding of timing. Logic arrives too late to be in charge. You see this clearly in moments of stress, unexpected expenses, market volatility, career uncertainty. In those moments, the body reacts first. Heart rate changes, muscles tense, attention narrows. Decision-making shifts from long-term reasoning to short-term protection. Smart people are not immune to this. If anything, they're often more affected because they notice the conflict. They feel the gap between what makes sense and what feels safe. That gap is uncomfortable. So they try to close it with more thinking. They explain, they justify, they debate internally. But thinking doesn't calm the nervous system. Only regulation does. This is why some people make calmer financial decisions with less knowledge. They are not less thoughtful. They are less reactive. They can feel uncertainty without rushing to eliminate it. They can tolerate discomfort without immediately acting to escape it. This capacity changes everything. It allows logic to play its proper role, supporting decisions, not defending emotions. Once people understand this sequence, something shifts. They stop asking, "What's the smartest move?" and start asking, "What am I feeling right now?" That question doesn't weaken decision-making. It strengthens it, because unacknowledged emotion drives behavior invisibly. Acknowledged emotion loses much of its control. This doesn't mean emotion should dictate financial choices. It means emotion must be recognized before logic can be effective. When people learn to notice fear, urgency, or excitement without immediately reacting, decisions slow down, not in a paralyzing way, in a stabilizing one. The result is not perfect rationality, it's consistency. Consistency matters more than brilliance in money decisions. This is why emotional awareness, not intelligence, is often the missing piece. Until emotion is acknowledged, logic will always be working after the fact, explaining, justifying, cleaning up. When emotion is brought into the process consciously, logic finally gets to do what it does best: clarify options, evaluate trade-offs, support deliberate action. This is when money decisions begin to feel less dramatic. Not because emotion disappears, but because it no longer secretly runs the show. Chapter 5. Comparison is the silent source of financial stress. One of the most powerful forces shaping financial stress is also one of the least discussed: comparison. Not the obvious kind. Not jealousy or competition in the traditional sense, but the quiet, constant measuring that happens in the background of everyday life. Most people don't wake up intending to compare themselves to others. It happens automatically. You see how others live, what they buy, where they travel, how quickly they seem to progress, and without consciously deciding to, you begin adjusting your internal standards. This is especially true for intelligent people, because intelligent people don't just compare outcomes, they compare trajectories. They ask subtle questions. Am I moving fast enough? Did I choose the right path? So should I be further along by now? These questions don't feel emotional, they feel analytical, but their effect is emotional. Comparison quietly shifts the definition of enough. What once felt stable begins to feel insufficient, not because circumstances changed, but because the reference point did. This is how financial stress grows without any obvious trigger. Nothing goes wrong, income doesn't drop, expenses don't explode, yet dissatisfaction increases. The mind starts treating someone else's situation as a benchmark, even when that situation has nothing to do with your goals, values, or constraints. This creates a subtle sense of pressure, not panic. Pressure. Pressure to earn more. Pressure to upgrade. Pressure to optimize. Pressure that feels rational, but never quite resolves. And one of the reasons comparison is so powerful is that it operates invisibly. People rarely say, "I'm stressed because I'm comparing myself." They say things like, "I just want to be more secure." "I feel like I should be doing better." "I don't want to fall behind." These statements sound reasonable. They even sound responsible. But underneath them is often a moving target. The definition of success keeps shifting, and when success keeps shifting, satisfaction becomes impossible. Social environments amplify this effect. In earlier generations, people compared themselves to a relatively small circle: family, neighbors, co-workers. Today, comparison happens at scale. You are exposed to highlights from thousands of lives, curated moments, selective outcomes. You rarely see the trade-offs, debt, anxiety, or uncertainty behind them. But your nervous system doesn't know that. It responds to what it sees. Repeated exposure creates the impression that progress should look a certain way: bigger, faster, more visible. This affects intelligent people in a specific way. They don't blindly copy others. They analyze. They try to reverse engineer success. If someone else achieved something, there must be a strategy behind it, a smarter approach, a better decision. So comparison becomes research, and research becomes pressure. This leads to a constant sense that you are missing something, not because you lack information, but because you are using other people's lives as input variables for your own decisions. This rarely produces clarity. It produces noise. Another reason comparison is so damaging is that it ignores context. Different people carry different constraints, different responsibilities, different risk tolerance, different definitions of safety. Yet comparison flattens all of that into a single scale. Who's ahead? Who's behind? That binary thinking creates tension. People begin to interpret normal financial trade-offs as personal shortcomings. Choosing stability feels like a lack of ambition. Choosing patience feels like falling behind. Choosing simplicity feels like underperformance. None of these interpretations are accurate. They are emotional responses to relative positioning. Comparison also interferes with long-term thinking. Instead of asking, "Is this decision right for my life?" people ask, "How does this decision look compared to others?" That shift changes everything. It pulls attention away from sustainability and toward image, even when no one is watching. This is why people often feel financial stress, even when they are objectively doing well. They are not reacting to their situation. They are reacting to their perception of where they stand, and perception is highly sensitive to comparison. There is another layer that makes this even more difficult for intelligent people. They are often surrounded by other high-achieving individuals, pairs with strong careers, ambitious goals, visible milestones. In these environments, comparison feels unavoidable. If everyone around you is progressing quickly, standing still, even intentionally, feels like failure. But this ignores a crucial fact. Financial stability is not a race, and there is no shared finish line. Comparison assumes a single path with a single measure of success. Money doesn't work that way. What looks like progress for one person may represent stress for another. What looks like ambition may hide fragility. What looks like success may be built on constant pressure. Without access to the full picture, comparison becomes misleading, and misleading comparisons create unnecessary stress. One of the clearest signs that comparison is driving financial anxiety is this feeling. No matter what you do, it never quite feels like enough. You reach a goal and immediately adjust the standard. You improve your situation and quickly notice someone further ahead. Satisfaction becomes temporary. This isn't because you're ungrateful. It's because comparison resets the baseline. The mind adapts quickly to improvements. But it adapts even faster to relative differences. So progress loses its emotional impact. The result is chronic dissatisfaction. People don't feel poor. They feel behind. And behind is a moving target. The way out of this is not to stop noticing others. That's unrealistic. It's to change what comparison is allowed to influence. When comparison determines self-worth, stress increases. When comparison determines strategy, clarity decreases. People who find peace with money don't eliminate comparison. They limit its authority. They stop using other people's outcomes as evidence about their own decisions. They measure progress internally, against values, against stability, against sustainability. This doesn't make them indifferent or unmotivated. It makes them grounded. Grounded people can observe others without destabilizing themselves. They can feel inspired without feeling threatened. They can learn without feeling deficient. This shift doesn't happen automatically. It requires conscious boundary setting around attention. What you regularly expose yourself to shapes what you feel pressured by. Reducing comparison isn't about ignorance, it's about focus. Focus on what your life actually requires, not what looks impressive, not what signals success externally, but what supports calm, continuity, and resilience. When people make this shift, financial stress often decreases, even before income changes, because the pressure was never purely financial. It was psychological. Comparison created urgency where none was required. It created dissatisfaction where stability already existed. Once that pressure lifts, decisions slow down. Spending becomes more intentional. Goals become more realistic. Money starts to feel like a tool again, not a scoreboard. This doesn't mean you stop growing. It means you stop chasing someone else's pace. And that alone removes a significant source of confusion. Chapter 6. Why smart people delay simplicity. For many intelligent people, simplicity feels suspicious. If something is truly effective, they assume it should also be complex. If a solution looks too straightforward, they worry it must be incomplete. This mindset works well in some areas of life. It fails quietly with money. Financial clarity rarely comes from sophistication. It comes from consistency. But consistency doesn't feel intellectually satisfying. It doesn't reward cleverness. It doesn't validate how much you know. So smart people often postpone it. They search for better systems, more refined strategies, more elegant solutions, all while overlooking what already works. This delay isn't accidental, it's psychological. Simplicity removes excuses. Once something is simple, the responsibility to follow through becomes unavoidable. Complexity, on the other hand, provides cover. It allows people to keep optimizing instead of committing. It allows them to feel engaged without feeling exposed. This is especially appealing to intelligent minds. Smart people enjoy solving problems. They enjoy improving systems. Money, however, doesn't reward constant improvement. It rewards staying with the same boring behaviors for a long time. Saving consistently, spending deliberately, avoiding unnecessary risk. These actions don't feel impressive. They don't scale intellectually. So the mind looks elsewhere. People redesign plans instead of executing them. They adjust frameworks instead of building habits. Over time, activity replaces progress. From the outside, it looks like discipline. From the inside, it feels like effort without relief. There's also a deeper reason simplicity is delayed. Simple systems leave little room to hide from emotional discomfort. When a financial plan is complex, failure can be blamed on the system. When it's simple, failure feels personal. That vulnerability is uncomfortable. So people add layers. They introduce conditions. They wait for better timing. They create rules that require constant decision-making. Each layer reduces exposure, but also reduces clarity. This pattern appears often in people who are used to being competent. They fear that a simple approach doesn't reflect their capability. They don't want their financial life to look unsophisticated. But money doesn't care how smart a strategy looks. It responds to what is repeatable. People who eventually feel at ease with money almost always simplify, not because they lack intelligence, but because they've learned where intelligence helps and where it doesn't. They stop trying to outthink uncertainty. They stop trying to optimize every decision. They choose structures that require less emotional energy. This frees attention. When fewer decisions are required, fewer emotions are triggered. When fewer emotions are triggered, clarity improves. Simplicity creates space. Space to observe. Space to adjust. Space to recover from mistakes without panic. Smart people often reach this realization later than others. Not because they're slow, but because they're capable of sustaining complexity longer. Eventually, the cost becomes too high. Mental fatigue sets in. Decision stress accumulates. Confidence erodes. And at that point, simplicity no longer feels naive. It feels necessary. When people finally simplify, they're often surprised by what happens. They feel calmer. They make fewer decisions, but better ones. They stop feeling behind, not because they found a smarter strategy, but because they stopped asking their mind to do work their nervous system couldn't support. This is a turning point. Simplicity doesn't mean doing less. It means removing friction, removing choices that don't matter, removing complexity that doesn't add safety. When smart people allow themselves to choose simple, stable systems, money begins to feel manageable. Not exciting, not impressive, but clear. And clarity, for the first time, becomes sustainable. Chapter 7. Clarity comes from identity, not numbers. Many people believe financial clarity comes from better numbers, more tracking, more projections, more detailed plans. When uncertainty appears, the instinct is to tighten control, update the spreadsheet, review the accounts, recalculate the future. These actions feel productive, but for many intelligent people, they don't bring peace. They bring temporary reassurance at best and renewed anxiety at worst. This happens because clarity does not originate in numbers. It originates in identity. How you see yourself in relation to money determines how those numbers feel. Two people can look at the same balance sheet and experience completely different emotions. One feels stable, the other feels exposed. The numbers are identical. The identities are not. Identity answers questions that spreadsheets cannot. Who am I when money is uncertain? What does safety mean to me? What am I trying to protect or prove? Without clear answers to these questions, numbers remain emotionally unstable. They inform, but they don't settle. Many intelligent people unconsciously adopt identities around money early in life. The responsible one, the provider, the achiever, the one who has it together. These identities create pressure. They don't allow room for uncertainty. They don't tolerate visible mistakes. So when money feels unclear, it threatens more than finances. It threatens self-image. This is why people often overmanage their money without feeling calmer. They're trying to reinforce an identity through control. But control doesn't create safety when identity is fragile. It creates vigilance. People say things like, "I just want to feel more in control. I need to stay on top of things." What they often mean is, "I need reassurance about who I am." Numbers can't provide that reassurance. Only identity can. Another common identity trap appears in people who define themselves as earners. They associate worth with productivity, security with income. As long as money is coming in, they feel okay. When income feels uncertain, anxiety spikes. This identity works until it doesn't. Because income is not fully controllable. Markets shift, careers change, energy fluctuates. When identity is tied too closely to earning, money clarity becomes fragile. Every fluctuation feels personal. Some people move in the opposite direction. They define themselves as savers. They feel safe only when money is untouched. Meaning spending feels like loss, even when it's intentional. This identity creates rigidity. Numbers look good, but life feels constrained. Again, the issue isn't knowledge. It's identity being asked to do too much. Clarity begins to form when people loosen these definitions, when they stop seeing money as proof of competence, when they stop using numbers as emotional anchors. This doesn't mean ignoring data. It means changing what data is allowed to represent. Money becomes a tool, not a mirror. People who reach this stage often describe a subtle shift. They still track, they still plan, but they no longer look to numbers for reassurance. They look inward. They define success more clearly, not as growth alone, not as optimization, but as sustainability. Can I live with this decision long term? Does this support the life I actually want? So can I tolerate the uncertainty that comes with it? These questions calm the nervous system more than projections ever could, because they align behavior with identity. Once identity stabilizes, numbers lose their emotional charge. They become information, not judgment. This is why some people feel at ease with money even when circumstances aren't perfect. Their identity isn't threatened by fluctuation. They don't need money to constantly confirm who they are. This doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people consciously redefine their role with money, from controller to steward, from performer to protector, from optimizer to caretaker. These shifts sound subtle. They aren't. They change how every decision feels. Without this shift, people keep chasing clarity through control. With it, clarity arrives through alignment. The numbers stop being the source of confidence. They become supporting characters, and that's when money finally begins to feel manageable. Not because it's perfect, but because it's no longer carrying the weight of identity. Another way identity quietly shapes money clarity is through the roles people feel trapped inside. Many intelligent people don't consciously choose these roles. They grow into them, the reliable one, the planner, the one who doesn't mess up. Over time, money becomes part of how these roles are maintained. Decisions are no longer just about outcomes. They're about staying consistent with who you believe you are supposed to be. This is why some people feel intense discomfort doing things that technically make sense. They hesitate to slow down because they've always been the one who pushes forward. They struggle to spend intentionally because they've always been the one who sacrifices. They resist simplifying because they've always been the one who understands complexity. Money challenges these identities, and when identity is challenged, the nervous system reacts as if something important is at stake. This reaction often gets mislabeled as financial anxiety. In reality, it's identity friction. A part of you senses that the old definition no longer fits. Another part fears what will happen if it's released. So, clarity stalls. People return to numbers because numbers feel solid. They feel objective. They feel safer than asking deeper questions. But numbers can only answer how much and how fast. They cannot answer why this matters or what this supports. Without those answers, decisions feel hollow. This is why some people reach financial milestones and still feel unsettled. They achieved the goal, but the identity underneath never adjusted. They expected relief. They got emptiness. Others experience the opposite. They make a decision that looks imperfect on paper, less optimal, less impressive, but feel a surprising sense of calm afterward. Not because the decision was flawless, but because it aligned with who they are becoming. This alignment is what creates stability, not certainty, not guarantees. Stability. Stability comes from knowing what you are optimizing for, not maximizing wealth, not minimizing risk, but supporting a life you can actually live inside. When identity is clear, trade-offs become easier to accept. You stop needing every decision to validate you. You stop needing money to prove competence. You stop interpreting fluctuation as failure. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you grounded. Grounded people can tolerate ambiguity. They can revise decisions without self-judgment. They can stay consistent without being rigid. Numbers still matter, but they stop being emotionally charged. They inform choices instead of defining worth. This is why clarity feels so different once identity settles. Money stops demanding attention. It stops interrupting thought. It stops leaking into every decision. Not because it disappeared, but because it's finally in its proper place. As a tool, not a test. Chapter 8. When money stops being emotional, there is a moment many people don't expect. It doesn't arrive with excitement, it doesn't feel dramatic, and it doesn't come with certainty. It arrives quietly. Money stops feeling emotional, not because problems disappear, not because everything is finally figured out, but because the internal reaction softens. People often imagine that peace with money comes after success, after the right income, after the right system, after enough time passes. In reality, peace usually comes before progress. It comes when money stops being interpreted as a signal about who you are, when a decision no longer feels like a test, when a mistake no longer feels like a verdict, when uncertainty no longer triggers urgency. This shift is subtle, but unmistakable. People describe it as space. Space between thought and action, space between numbers and emotion, space between external outcomes and internal stability. That space changes everything. When money is emotional, decisions feel rushed. People want relief. They want closure. They move quickly, not toward clarity, but away from discomfort. When money becomes less emotional, decisions slow down, not because people hesitate, but because they no longer feel chased. They can sit with uncertainty without immediately reacting. They can acknowledge fear without obeying it. They can make imperfect decisions without spiraling. This is not detachment, it's regulation. Regulation allows logic to work properly, not as a defense mechanism, but as a guide. People often notice that once this shift happens, they think about money less. Not because they don't care, but because it no longer demands attention. Money stops interrupting thought. It stops hijacking mood. It stops coloring unrelated decisions. It becomes quieter. And in that quiet, patterns change. Spending becomes more intentional, not restrictive. Saving becomes more purposeful, not compulsive. Planning becomes supportive, not obsessive. People stop reacting to fluctuations as emergencies. They see changes for what they are, data, not danger. This doesn't eliminate risk. It changes the relationship with it. Risk is no longer something to eliminate at all costs. It becomes something to manage with awareness. This is where consistency emerges. Not forced discipline, not rigid control. Consistency rooted in steadiness. People who reach this stage don't suddenly make perfect decisions. They still make mistakes. They still revise plans. So they still encounter uncertainty. What's different is how those moments are experienced. Mistakes become feedback, not shame. Adjustments become normal, not alarming. Uncertainty becomes expected, not threatening. This emotional neutrality is often mistaken for indifference. It isn't. It's maturity. Maturity allows people to prioritize sustainability over optimization. They stop asking, "Is this the best possible move?" and start asking, "Can I live with this decision calmly over time, sir?" That question changes behavior more than any spreadsheet. It removes the pressure to be exceptional. It removes the fear of being wrong. It removes the urgency to keep up. What remains is something quieter, and far more powerful. Self-trust. Self-trust doesn't mean believing every decision will work out. It means believing you can handle the outcome. That belief reduces emotional charge dramatically. Once people trust themselves to recover, they stop needing certainty to move forward. They don't require constant reassurance. They don't need to control every variable. They don't need money to confirm their worth. This is why progress often accelerates after peace appears. Not because people try harder, but because they stop wasting energy on internal conflict. Decisions become cleaner. Fewer internal debates. Fewer emotional reversals, fewer reactive choices. Money starts working in the background, not as a source of identity, not as a measure of success, but as a tool supporting life. This is the point many intelligent people spend years trying to reach through thinking alone. They don't realize that clarity was never waiting for more understanding, so it was waiting for emotional settlement. Once money stops being emotional, life begins to feel lighter, not easier, not perfect, lighter, because fewer moments feel loaded, fewer decisions feel existential, fewer outcomes feel personal, and that lightness creates room for patience, room for long-term thinking, room for a relationship with money that is stable rather than intense. This is not the end of learning. It's the end of confusion, because confusion was never about money itself. It was about what money was being asked to represent. When that burden is removed, money becomes manageable, not impressive, not dramatic, just clear. And clarity, once it arrives, tends to stay. As this audiobook comes to an end, I want to step out of analysis for a moment and speak personally. Not as someone who has figured money out, but as someone who spent a long time feeling quietly unsettled by it. For years, I believed my confusion meant I hadn't learned enough yet, that there was another book, another framework, another insight I was missing. What I didn't understand then was this: I wasn't lacking knowledge. I was lacking permission to feel calm without certainty. Once I saw that, my relationship with money began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. I stopped expecting money to give me reassurance. I stopped using numbers as emotional feedback. I stopped interpreting every decision as a statement about my intelligence or worth. Money didn't become simpler overnight, but it became quieter, and that quiet made space for better decisions. What I've come to believe is that many smart people don't struggle with money because they're careless or unprepared. They struggle because they are deeply thoughtful, and they turn that thoughtfulness inward in ways that create pressure rather than clarity. They overanalyze because they care. They hesitate because they want to be responsible. They feel confused because they are trying to get it right. There is nothing wrong with that, but there is a moment when effort stops helping. A moment when clarity no longer comes from more thinking, but from accepting that money will always involve uncertainty, and that uncertainty does not need to be eliminated to live well. If there is one idea I hope stays with you after listening, it's this: you don't need to resolve every question about money to have a stable relationship with it. You don't need perfect answers. You don't need constant confidence. You don't need to feel certain all the time. What you need is steadiness. Steadiness in how you respond to discomfort. Steadiness in how you interpret outcomes. Steadiness in how you separate money from identity. When that steadiness develops, confusion loses its intensity. It doesn't disappear completely, but it stops dominating your attention. Money becomes something you work with, not something you wrestle. Looking back, I realized that the people I admire most for their financial clarity are not the ones who know the most. They are the ones who move through decisions without drama. They don't rush. They don't panic. They don't need money to constantly validate them. They've learned something subtle but powerful: that peace with money is not a reward for success. It's a prerequisite for it. So if listening to this audiobook helped you see your own confusion differently, not as a flaw, but as a signal, then it has done what it was meant to do. Not to give you answers, but to help you ask better questions. Questions that don't demand perfection. Questions that don't rush resolution. Questions that allow you to move forward calmly, even when everything isn't clear yet. Money will always change. Life will always shift. But the way you relate to both can become more stable, more grounded, and more forgiving. And when that happens, something important follows. Not excitement, not certainty, but ease. And ease over time compounds quietly, just like everything else that lasts.